Emergency Planning and Community Right to Know Act, Epcra. That's what we're covering right now, right after lunch. There are 4 key components of Epcra, 3 of which we'll cover in this section. The other one will come in the hazardous release reporting section, which we'll cover next. First is emergency planning, then the hazardous chemical reporting, and the toxic chemical release inventory reporting. All of these have to do with reporting requirements related to hazardous chemicals that are stored or used on campus. So the first is the emergency planning requirement. And what this says under Epcra, the Emergency Planning Community Right to Know Act, if you have extremely hazardous substances on site above threshold planning quantities, TPQs, you have to take certain actions. So the EHSs, extremely hazardous substances, are listed at 40 CFR 355 Appendix A, a whole slew of chemical names listed there. So what you need to figure out is if you've got them up to above the TPQ, what you've got to do, notify the State Emergency Response Commission, the CERC, that you have an EHS on site above the TPQ, threshold planning quantity. And secondarily, designate an emergency coordinator on campus who can participate in local emergency planning, and then notify the LEPC, the Local Emergency Planning Committee, of who that person is so they can have them participate if they would like. Now, to give you an idea of what some of the EHSs are you likely to have any? The ones that we most commonly could potentially see on campus, and there aren't a lot of them that you're likely to have, and many campuses may not have any, but things like chlorine, if you have it at 100 pounds. Now, it's not sodium hypochlorite, but actual chlorine. Formaldehyde at 500, probably unlikely. This is the one we see most often, sulfuric acid at 1,000 pounds, and that is because you've got a lot of sulfuric acid in lead-acid batteries. People don't think about that, but if you've got a big UPI system, uninterrupted power supply system, or if you've got big telecommunication backup systems, you can have giant banks of batteries that have dozens of big batteries in them. On top of that, your emergency generators often have, 4 or 6 big batteries associated with them. You can have big floor scrubbers that have the big batteries. Don't count things like vehicle batteries, but any other batteries in equipment or those fixed backup systems. If you have 1,000 pounds or more of sulfuric acid in those, then you would exceed this threshold planning limit and have to be subject to the emergency planning requirements. And again, that's the most common one. And then ammonia, 500 pounds. Probably don't have a whole lot of ice rinks down here, but up north, a lot of colleges have ice rinks, and if they've got ammonia cooling systems, they very easily can exceed 500 pounds of ammonia. And others. Again, not too many are likely to be at a campus, but you should take a look at the list and get an idea of which ones potentially could be there. They don't. Oh, you were understanding they do?
Yeah.
And where did you get that?
From our recent audit.
No,
Okay.
not motorized. What about carts?
Yeah.
Like,
All cars.
I guess I don't know what the difference would, are they discussing that back there, how it's been applied recently?
Oh, they're talking about the golf course.
Oh, all right. We had a question about how this has been applied, the sulfuric acid, as far as lead-acid batteries and vehicle batteries on campuses at recent audits. It's been my understanding that vehicles are not counted toward this calculation of 1,000 pounds.
I think that's right, except for some reason I thought that the little, we're going to call them the golf carts, I think those do count. The traditional car,
Okay,
that's
so a
not-
distinction between a, on-the-road vehicle and the on-campus electric vehicles sort of things.
Why would they separate them?
I don't know, because I'm not familiar with that distinction.
I don't know the exact reason. I think that there is a specific exemption for car vehicles, but then somebody in a regulatory agency made a determination that a golf cart is not the same thing as a vehicle.
Making it more like equipment
Yeah.
rather than a vehicle.
That's as much as I can recall off the top of my head.
Can we get a good, because that's going to beat me up significantly. I know it's going to be a lot of us.
Everybody.
Everybody
Yeah.
is.
Can we get a good rule?
And I think it's silly because
No EPA, they're gonna change it.
I don't think this is the spirit of the act, is it?
It's not.
I mean,
And what's the chance of all of them breaking?
blowing up at
one
once.
Right, well, and again, but it's not necessarily in an individual container. It is cumulatively around campus, no matter what you're talking about. If you were talking about, if you had drums of chlorine around campus, it wouldn't be per single drum. It would be, we've got 4 here, 2 here, 1 there. What do you have totally? You're right. I mean, what are the chances of you having an extremely hazardous substance release and a major emergency response relative to your sulfuric acid and your lead acid batteries? Extremely minimal. But if you want to comply with the letter of the law, that's where you are. And frankly, it's not a big requirement. It's a one-time notification on each end, to the CERC and to the LEPC. And if you are a campus, you're likely participating in local emergency planning anyway, because you're one of the bigger entities in your community. So I would say, to be safe, just go ahead and do that one-time notification, and that's all you've got to do for a strict interpretation.
How do you estimate how much sulfuric acid is in that?
You can start with the MSDS if you can, because of course only a fraction of the weight is going to be actually the acid. And if it's not on there, you can contact the manufacturer and they'll tell you for the most part. Dan, you have more?
Also, I've gone online several times, and you can get a rough estimate usually from one of the websites. It's not perfect, but it's a reasonably decent estimate.
Enough to let you know whether you're going to get to that 1,000 pounds.
I think it was about 10 pounds for a 12-volt battery. Remember?
That was part of the, kind of the emergency backup.
Yeah, and it will vary. I mean, you can have lead acid batteries that are this big, or the standard size that you might associate with a vehicle, something like that. So, now to sort of preview, the next one we had that you're alluding to is a hazardous chemical reporting. This is separate, a distinct component. And this applies that if you have threshold quantities of hazardous substances stored on campus, you could be subject to various reporting on how much you have and where those chemicals are. And before any of you get excited about state agency, let me get all the way through the slide. The way this works and the way you do this reporting is if you have an extremely hazardous substance at 500 pounds or the TPQ, whichever is lower. So remember on the last slide we saw that sulfuric acid had a TPQ of 1,000 pounds. Here, for this reporting, you have to use 500 pounds or the TPQ, whichever is lower. So instead of 1,000 pounds, we'd use 500 pounds for sulfuric acid. The other item you have to report are hazardous chemicals if you have them on site at 10,000 pounds or more. And everybody's going to say, we don't have 10,000 pounds of any one hazardous chemical. But the way that hazardous chemical is defined here is based upon the OSHA definition of hazardous chemical, which is anything that presents a chemical or a physical hazard, which is anything that has an MSDS, which is anything you've got on campus basically aside from water. I mean, it could... Water has an MSDS? Oh,
Sand and gravel have MSDS.
absolutely. So if you were fully subject to this requirement, which you're not, we'll get to that in a moment, and you had a 10,000 pound sand pile, you'd be subject to this reporting for sand as a hazardous chemical. You would be for any petroleum products. If you had more than 10,000 pounds of diesel, number 2 fuel oil, just about anything. I mean, up north, all of our schools have salt piles for salting the roads in the winter. All of that's included. But there is a bit of an out for you. If you do have to do this, if you did, what you do is submit an initial MSDS or chemical inventory to the local emergency planning committee, state emergency response commission, and your local fire department. And then you'd have to do annual tier 2 inventories. Every March 1st, let them know the quantity you have of all of these required reporting chemicals, where they're stored, and update that every year. Because you are a state agency and you're not technically subject to OSHA requirements, and this requirement goes back to OSHA definition of employer and hazardous chemical, you're technically not subject to this. You don't have to do tier 2 reporting. But the Board of Regents has made an agreement with EPD to do sort of modified reporting. You won't file the federal tier 2 form, but what you're supposed to be doing on an annual basis is sending a letter notification to the LEPC, the CERC, Fire Department, and Board of Regents, letting them know about substantial hazardous chemicals that you have on site, where they are, and the properties associated with them. Is anybody doing this reporting right now? Okay, because it's ambiguous as to how and what you report. So maybe you can provide, because if you look at the sample letter, let me just show you quickly. This is sort of the sample letter that they give folks as to how they need to report. And it just generally says facility name, address, building number, type and location of hazardous materials, and hazards. So then the final piece of Epcra that we're going to talk about is toxic release inventory reporting, You may have heard of this as TRI forms, Form Rs, Form As. You should not be subject to this as a college or university because this is based upon the NAIC code. It has to do with significant volumes, thousands of pounds of hazardous chemicals that are manufactured, processed, or otherwise used by facilities. And so shouldn't come into play with what you're doing because you're not under those subject industries. But just to make sure we mention that to you. Are there any questions about the hazardous chemical reporting, the Epcra pieces that we just went through? That again is going back to an OSHA rather than an EPA requirement, and I don't know what the Board of Regents requirement is for that. Because
It has to be accessible. I can give you the little booklet.
Well,
That's not OSHA, that's
but-
Board of Labor.
but how often do you have to do that? How often do you have to update
Update what?
the
right to know program.
Right to know program?
I'll look it up and make sure.
Yeah, it comes from an OSHA requirement, but because you're not subject to OSHA, it appears that the board has developed their own corresponding requirement for right to know. And so check and see what that policy is. Okay, so if we then move on to section 19, hazardous substance release reporting. Well, no, not yet. You have a practical exam after this. Okay, so this is pretty self-explanatory. It's on reporting requirements for releases of hazardous substances. 3 different requirements that we're going to go over, 2 on the federal side. First is CERCLA, the Comprehensive Environmental Response Compensation and Liability Act, and that's at 40 CFR 302. And then the piece of Epcra that we didn't cover just a moment ago, the release reporting piece of Epcra, which is at 40 CFR 355.40. Georgia has their own release reporting requirement, which is called the Georgia Hazardous Site Response Regulation, and that's at Rule 391-3-19-.04. So first we have to know what is defined as a release. Like so many of the programs we've been covering, what fits into that definition. And there's a pretty lengthy definition for the federal programs. Basically, a release is any spilling, leaking, pumping, pouring, emitting, emptying, discharging, injecting, escaping, leaching, dumping, or disposing into the environment, including the abandonment or discarding of barrels, containers, and other closed receptacles of any hazardous chemical, extremely hazardous substance, or CERCLA hazardous substance. That's a release under the federal rules. Starting with the CERCLA side of release reporting. CERCLA you may also know as Superfund. You've heard about this. Cleanup sites, hazardous waste sites. There are over 800 hazardous substances listed, and they're found in Table 302.4 of 40 CFR Part 302. And if you go to that area, you'll find them all listed out, along with the reportable quantities. Everybody's familiar with the term reportable quantity, RQ? Right, so if you have a release equal to or in excess of a reportable quantity, then you could potentially have a reporting situation that you have to do. And so the chemicals are listed along with their RQs. The RQs for hazardous wastes, which are identified in 40 CFR, the Part 261 that you went through on Monday. Everybody knows what hazardous waste is now. But the characteristic hazardous waste, the ignitable, corrosive, reactive, toxic, the RQ is 100 pounds. The exception to that is if you're dealing with a toxic characteristic waste, those ones that contain the heavy metals, some of the chlorinated compounds, the DOO4 through DOO, whatever it is. Then when you're figuring out the RQ, you have to look up and see if it's on there, what its individual RQ is in Table 302.4. And I'll give you an example. Benzene is a delisted hazardous waste. If you typically have a characteristic hazardous waste, it's 100 pounds. But because benzene is on that D list for toxic characteristic waste, you have to go and see if it's on the CERCLA list of hazardous substances. Benzene is, and its reportable quantity is 10. So if you had a release of waste benzene, the reportable quantity would be 10 rather than this sort of generic 100 pounds for characteristic waste. Just a little thing you have to keep track of. And the RQs have a big range. The RQ for something like mercury is 1 pound, but most other chemicals are significantly higher. They can be well into the thousands of pounds, 5,000 pounds, that has to be released before there's a reporting requirement. So when do you have to report under CERCLA? If there's a release of a hazardous substance equal to or exceeding its reportable quantity in any 24-hour period, you immediately report it to the National Response Center. We've got the phone number. They don't. I think it's as soon as possible so that you're not compromising a response effort. You want to get that effort going to contain it and to stop the flow of the release and get things initiated. But as soon as you can safely do it without compromising that, I think that's what they consider immediate. I think it would certainly be within a couple of hours.
For those of us in Chatham County, I think it's still in operation. Immediate means within 15 minutes because we are so close to the navigable waters for everything.
So you're saying that
15
that's,
minutes.
and who is that coming from, that
Chatham
interpretation?
Emergency Management.
That's what they want to see in a report in. Okay. Yeah, certainly as soon as possible. And you're probably right, it can likely be within a couple of hours. But if you were to call 8 hours later, I think you'd have a hard time making an argument that that was as soon as you could possibly have done it. Okay, so certain releases under CERCLA do not have to be reported. Federally permitted releases, releases that only expose persons within a workplace, engine exhaust emissions, release of material from a nuclear incident, I'm assuming that's because that's going to be handled by the NRC, and normal application of fertilizer. Continuous releases are also handled a little bit differently under reporting. And an example of a continuous release is one that, well, it occurs without interruption or abatement, or that is routine, anticipated, incidental to your operations, part of your process. Example of this could be fugitive emissions from some sort of a process. So you've got a continuous release. These can often be permitted, but they have separate release reporting requirements, which I didn't go into because I don't think anybody is going to have any sort of continuous release situation. All right, now, Epcra, extremely hazardous substances. So that was the CERCLA release reporting. Now we're moving back over into Epcra for a similar but slightly different release reporting requirement. Epcra designates several hundred extremely hazardous substances based on their toxicity, and we know this because we talked about those materials in the reporting segment earlier. And the EHSs and their RQs, reportable quantities, are listed in Appendix A alphabetically and Appendix B by CAS number at 40 CFR Part 355. So under Epcra reporting, if there is a release of a CERCLA hazardous substance, which we just spoke of, an extremely hazardous substance that equals or exceeds its RQ and extends beyond the boundaries of the facility, then the owner-operator has an obligation to notify the LEPC, Local Emergency Planning Committee, of any local areas that could be affected, or the CERC of any states likely to be affected. And hopefully you're not making multi-state notifications, because I can't imagine what's happened if you're affecting more than Georgia. Okay. If you have to do the release notification, this is the information that you should be supplying when you make that immediate notification. We won't read through this because we're not doing training on doing a reporting, but all of this, to the extent the information is known, should be given to the report. As soon as practicable, after the reportable release, follow-up written notice has to be done describing all of this. What did you take to respond to the action? What are any acute or chronic health effects that are likely to be associated? And where it's appropriate, if there are some potential health hazards, what sort of advice is there for medical attention for potentially affected parties? As with the CERCLA reporting, there are exceptions when Epcra release reporting is not required, and they're quite similar. If the result is exposure only to people within the boundaries of the facility, federally permitted releases similar to the continuous release scenario we discussed right there under CERCLA, normally applied pesticides because you are meaning to apply those, it's not an accident, a release that doesn't meet the definition of a release, or most radionuclide releases, and again, covered under NRC. Georgia has their own release reporting requirements, and they include Georgia regulated substances has 3 categories of materials. They cover the hazardous substances in 302 under CERCLA, the extremely hazardous substances listed under Epcra, and hazardous constituents listed under the hazardous waste regulations back at 40 CFR Part 261. So all of these combined are considered regulated substances in Georgia, and they have a complete list at Appendix 1 to Rule 391-3-19. So what is a release in Georgia? Similar to, but just a little bit different from the federal definition of release, and also a little bit more complicated to determine whether you actually have a release, because sometimes you're going to see here, you might have to do some sampling and testing to determine whether you meet the criteria. A release to groundwater that exceeds naturally occurring background concentration, a release to soil that exceeds the concentration designated in Appendix 1, or discarding or abandoning regulated substances in barrels, drums, containers, tanks, other vessels, process units, waste management units that are not permitted. So that's a release under Georgia. Now, you do have a bit of a leeway in that you've got 30 days to report this release. And I guess if you're going to have to do some analytical testing, you're going to need a little bit of time to determine whether you've exceeded those levels that they outline. But within 30 days of discovering a reportable release, you have to notify EPD of all of this information. And you can see that it's going to take some time to get this information together, topographic maps, everything else, to give them a clear picture of what the release was and the extent of it. And again, the additional materials that have to be reported if you do have to report a release to EPD. There are exceptions, numerous exceptions. The ones that you are most likely to encounter are a release that is cleaned up within 30 days. So it is no longer meets the definition of a release. It's been taken care of and abated. A release being cleaned up under emergency response authorities. Emissions or releases regulated under other state laws, or releases of petroleum-based fuels, lubricants, or hydraulic fluids. So they're not covering those under this release reporting requirement. That was release reporting. Are there any questions about that? Well, I mean, when you're auditing, it's basically, you're asking the facility first off, have you had any reportable releases? If so, review the records, make sure things seem to have been done within the required time frames. If not, I mean, other than that, all you can do is when you're walking around, do you see evidence in discussions with anyone? Do they raise an issue that makes you think, gosh, you know, maybe there was a release and you need to ask a few more questions? But really, you're sort of relying on information provided by the campus to determine whether there have been any. And a lot of times, facilities keep records of all sorts of spills and releases, whether they're reportable or not. And that's certainly a good practice, because if there's ever a question down the road, you've got it documented, what spilled, how much spilled, what were the results, how was it cleaned up. And if they keep those records, you can take a look through and just make sure that any of them that are listed in there don't meet the definition of a reportable release and weren't reported. Any questions? No? Well, I think a break, Dan? A break, and I'm done, so I thank you all very much for paying attention for these past 2 days, and it's been a pleasure meeting you all, working with you. Thank you.